Hello and welcome. You're watching our special show, Coronavirus Facts versus Myths. I'm Gargi Rao. This is the show where we get you all the latest on the virus, on the variants and the vaccine as well. AstraZeneca vaccine, our first big focus on the show today. AstraZeneca announced the long-awaited results of the US and South American study of its vaccine, and it was the first bit of positive news in recent weeks. This after a number of European countries have halted its use due to reports of blood clot complications. Now, AstraZeneca found that its vaccine was 79% efficacious in protecting against symptoms of COVID. But now, in the fresh development, the US National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases has said that the company may have provided incomplete data. Well, to talk more about this entire issue, we're now joined by Dr. Isaac Bogoch, infectious disease expert, University of Toronto. Thank you so much for joining us on the show again. Tell us firstly about what AstraZeneca has announced regarding this US study. Now, this study, they haven't yet provided data and it's to be peer reviewed.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful news. So we only have a press release, so it's hard to delve deep in the data. But based on the results that they were able to share in the press release, they demonstrated that indeed the vaccine was about 79%. The efficacy was about 79%, and that was still maintained in populations over the age of 65. So that's obviously very good news. And they didn't see any safety concerns in the people that received the vaccine. Again, it was a big study, and it looks like it was a very well-conducted study. Over 32,000 people were enrolled in this study. Again, all arrows pointing in the direction that this is a very effective vaccine and that we really should be rolling this out en masse right now.
So do you think, Doctor, now this will help the controversy in Europe? Will it finally lay it to rest? Or do you think there's too much damage done already and, too much vaccine hesitancy after several countries announced a brief pause on the vaccine?
Yeah, well, I think the controversy was there was two points. One is some people just didn't feel comfortable giving it to people over the age of 65 because not enough people over that age bracket were enrolled in the initial clinical studies. And since then, there has been a lot of real-world data that has come out supporting the use of this vaccine in older populations. So most countries, not all, but I believe most countries have actually now allowed the vaccine in the over 65 crowd. The second controversy was related to what appear to be very, very rare blood clots in people receiving this vaccine. I think it's important to note that the clinical trial that was just conducted did not see any evidence of that. But we should also remember that that's a clinical trial of just over 32,000 people. These blood clots are very, very rare events, and you wouldn't expect to see a signal in a clinical trial of that size. Even though that's a large clinical trial, I think these, if there's an association, and we can't sweep that under the rug, if there's an association, you're only going to see that when millions and millions and millions of people are vaccinated. So I still think it's important to keep our eye on that. And of course, you can't sweep any potential adverse reactions under the rug. But on the other hand, based on everything we know right now, today, it does still appear to be a very safe and effective vaccine.
Right. But the claims in Europe did sound quite worrying, even though it was a handful of cases, but it was seemingly healthy people who developed these blood clots in the brain. Was it just an abundance of caution, or was it something that caused just too much damage?
I completely agree. And of course, we have to we have to be fair, right? We have to be honest and transparent. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know, and here's how we're going to find out what we don't know. I think it's still safe to say that that chapter about the blood clots is not finished yet. It hasn't been written yet. We know a bit more about it now than we did the week before. We certainly know it's extremely rare, but we have to also remember that not all blood clots are created the same. There's different types of blood clots. This is a type of blood clot that's associated with very low levels of platelets and associated with blood clots in, I would just say, non-conventional places or less common places, like the veins that drain blood from the brain. That's not a common event. And if there's any potential temporal association between that happening and the vaccine, you still need to investigate it. You can't ignore it, and it still needs to be looked at. I still think we have to we still have to put that in the bigger context of, if there is a real association, it's still, based on what we know now, a very, very rare event. And based on what we know now, I think it's completely reasonable to proceed with mass vaccine efforts. It doesn't mean you ignore it. It means you study it. If there's time to pivot later on because the data suggests, great, you can pivot later on. But I don't think we're at a point where we would do such a thing right now.
Now, obviously, you don't want to be one of those, rare events or 1 in a million who experience this blood clotting, if there is any connection. So is there something that one can look out for in connection with these rare events? What do hospitals and doctors, need to be alert about? There are reports of some blue patches also appearing. What can you tell us?
Yeah, there certainly is. And again, I always have to remind people that this would be a very, very rare event. But I think you're going to start to see many countries put a little update on the vaccine or provide a Dear Doctor note that basically suggests that there's an extremely rare possibility that something like this can occur. And you watch out for things like headaches and a particular type of rash that is often seen when people have very, very low levels of platelets in their body. And there's sort of characteristic signs that many clinicians will know about, but I think it's still important to remind them that this is something that, the risk isn't 0%, but it's extremely, extremely low, but you've got to watch out for it just in case. So if you have someone who's had the vaccine and starts to complain about a few symptoms, including a headache and including a rash that's indicative of very low platelets, it raises a red flag. It certainly requires investigation and of course it requires reporting so that people can conduct a more thorough investigation to see if it indeed was associated with the vaccine. But still, I know I sound like a broken record, but it's still important to note that this vaccine, based on all the clinical studies, based on the real world studies, shows that it is in general a very safe product, and also that it really does a great job in preventing people from getting COVID-19. And in those who are unlucky enough to get COVID-19 who have been vaccinated with the Astrazeneca product, it reduces the risk of severe outcomes and hospitalization and death. So, there's a lot of good reasons to get this vaccine. Can't ignore very, very rare adverse events that are potentially associated with it, but we have to put it in the bigger context.
Right now, staying with the AstraZeneca vaccine, but another aspect here in India, we've increased the duration between doses of the vaccine, from 4 to 6 weeks to over 8 weeks. And because this increases the efficacy, what do you have to say about that? There have been some studies.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable, and that's a data-driven decision, and I think that aligns with some of the emerging data in that with this particular vaccine, you can space the doses out to, some reasonable amount between 1 or 2 months. I think some places are even doing it to 3 months. I think you've got to be a little bit more careful in those who are at the extremes of age, like the older population and people who have compromised immune systems, because there is emerging data that they just don't mount the same degree of response. They don't mount the same robust immune response to the vaccine, and perhaps delaying a second dose in some cohorts might not be the best idea. But in general, there is excellent data that demonstrates you can stretch out the time between dose 1 and dose 2. And of course, that allows you to vaccinate and protect a larger proportion of your population in a shorter period of time. We've got to be careful. I know many parts of India are headed into a third wave. There are rising case numbers in many parts of India, and this would be an excellent time to really provide widespread protection to the community at large, and you can do that by spacing out the dosing.
Right, Doctor, as you mentioned, here in India, cases are rising. We had hoped to avoid this next wave, but it seems it's laxity. Also worry about the role that the mutant variants may be playing in creating this havoc.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I share your concerns. Obviously, the world is watching very closely because, sadly, a few months ago, India had just astronomically high levels of COVID-19, but it was extremely impressive watching the country come together and do the right thing and take measures to curb infection. And we watched cases in India plummet, and that was very inspiring for the rest of the world to see. But, obviously it's a sustained effort. There's still a lot of people that are susceptible to this infection because they haven't been vaccinated or they haven't had a recent infection and recovered from it. So there's still a tremendous number of people in the country, just like globally, that are susceptible to this infection. And quite frankly, there's no secrets now. We know how this infection is transmitted and where it's transmitted. And if you get people together in indoor environments in close proximity, of course, without masks, you just increase the likelihood of transmission. So until we really scale up vaccine programs, of course in India, but of course I'm in Canada and elsewhere in the world, we're really not safe. And we really have to keep firm pressure on the vaccine front, but also firm pressure on taking the steps necessary to keep individuals and populations safe. Putting on masks indoors, washing our hands, creating better ventilated indoor spaces, avoiding crowded indoor spaces where we can. And that's, of course, not just at home. I mean, it's easier said than done, but it really involves focusing on what are, quite frankly, more vulnerable populations within our countries, right? We know the living conditions in many parts of our countries are very conducive to this. We know that the working conditions in many parts of our countries, both India and Canada, are conducive for transmission. We have to protect the most vulnerable among us. We have to do everything we can to ensure everybody has a safe living and working environment and has the tools at hand to prevent themselves and their families from getting this infection.
Right. Well, Dr. Isaac Bogoch, thank you so much for speaking to us here at NDTV. Now, with COVID cases rising in the country, the question has been as to how much of a role are the mutant strains playing in this spike in cases. Now, just now in Punjab, it's been found that 81% of the samples that tested positive show that it was the more infectious UK strain. So imagine that out of 401 samples, 81% of them showed the UK strain. There are also reports in Maharashtra that 2 mutations have been identified there. We need more information on that. There's been a complaint that not enough genome analysis is being done in the country. Just 0.06% of positive tests so far have been analyzed and the genomic sequencing been done. And compare this to the UK, in which over 5% of the positive, the tests that have come positive are tested for genomic sequencing. And that is something that we need to aspire to. Well, to talk more about these concerns, we're joined by Dr. Ambrish Mittal, Chairman and Head Endocrinology and Diabetes Max Healthcare. Also Dr. Rahul Pandit, member of the COVID Task Force in Maharashtra. Dr. Pandit, first to you, this information about Punjab is very, very concerning, that 81% of their positive cases have, it's been found that they are the UK strain of coronavirus. And this is something I know that's been raised in Maharashtra as well, as to how much of a role mutated, variants of coronavirus are playing in this spike that we're seeing.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I completely agree with you. I think that has been our concern, and that's why we've actually increased the genome sequencing, and we've actually requested the government to do a lot more genome sequencing. There are certain patterns which are seen on this particular wave. We have a very, very rapidly spreading virus here right now in Maharashtra, and maybe probably the rest of the country as well, which is quite concerning for all of us. The second thing is that the virulence may be particularly a bit low. We are not seeing a lot of patients on ventilator in this part of the pandemic right now, but we may see them as we go forward possibly. But as of now, we don't actually have that quite in numbers there. But a lot of patients are requiring high flow oxygen and high flow ventilators, high flow nasal cannulas to be put into the ICU. But majority of them are asymptomatic. 80% plus are asymptomatic. So these patterns are particularly, pointing towards at least a homegrown strain. If not a UK strain, but it's a homegrown mutant strain which is there. And I think we need to do a lot of genome sequencing from various districts and samples across the state to actually come to a point that are we looking at something like a similar to a UK strain, or it is the UK strain which we are actually seeing in Maharashtra or rest of the country. So yes, I agree with you. Genome sequencing needs to be done.
Right. Dr. Ambrish Mittal, the good news is that Covishield, if it is the UK strain and various strains, the vaccine is effective against that. But again, we need a lot more information. Also, we believe that younger people, that's what Punjab has said, at least that many younger people seem to be affected by this particular strain.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is no doubt that we need to vaccinate more and more people. We are still not sure how well the vaccine works against all the mutant strains, but it seems to be effective against the UK strain. So that's very good news. I think the important part is to open up the vaccination now in a way that more and more people can have access to it. And I think the fundamental thing in that, of course, we have to protect the vulnerable the most, but also the fact that we have to ensure that there is less restriction. So, for example, in my experience, the 45 to 60 age group, that is now being vaccinated with particular comorbidities, that norm is being flouted everywhere. Either we shouldn't have it, or if we really think it's important, we should implement it. So I think if you're using an simple age cutoff for the moment, that is one good step in the right direction, and not having that whole list, which is very well intentioned, but I'm not finding that to be implemented all around me in patients. The second point is that we need to identify hot areas. The hot areas here would be like offices, like courts, like, closed environments where a lot of people are congregating, and there, regardless of the age or regardless of comorbidities, vaccination should be open there. So I think we'll have to do these little things. Right. Otherwise, if we just stick to the current strategy, a lot of people are not coming forward for vaccination, and a lot of vaccines are going waste.
Absolutely. And Dr. Pandit, for some have even suggested for states in which we've seen more cases, like in Maharashtra, that we should, concentrate more of the vaccination drives over there. And as Dr. Mittal was saying, we need it to be far and wide, and more people, especially, younger people, because they're the ones who are out and about, who are going for work, and on whom the economy also depends. So really the need to, speed up the entire vaccination drive, especially if the variant is there. So we need to really get ahead of this.
Absolutely right. Again, with you, couldn't agree more. I've been saying this on the national TV for some time now, that actually the super spreaders are the ones who are stepping out of the house, not the ones who are in the house. So the population above 60 is actually quite adherent to COVID appropriate behavior, and they are staying indoors. But our younger population, on whom the economy depends, 20 to 50 years of age, they are the ones who are going out. The COVID appropriate behavior is at all-time low in that age group. So unless we vaccinate them parallelly, we will not be able to break the chain. The vulnerable group you vaccinate, you will be able to have mortality come down significantly. But to break the chain, we need to vaccinate these people. The other thing which I again want to say is that we need to open it up and bring it to the doorstep of the person. Just like we do it in our national elections, the Lok Sabha elections, where there's a voting booth within a walking distance of a person's home, we need to have a vaccination booth set up within the walking distance so that people can come out and get themselves vaccinated. Right now in Maharashtra, the people are doing an RT-PCR, a rapid antigen test before entering a mall. Maybe we need to think outside the box and say that you take a vaccine before entering the mall. So that, we actually vaccinate. So we need to have some out-of-the-box solutions for this. We need to increase our education and information about the vaccine as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Pandit and Dr. Mittal, for making these very, valid points. And we need to create more pressure on the government to really speed up the entire process and, take these factors into account, especially if it's the variant that is out there. We really need to get ahead of it in the vaccination drive. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. Well, with that, time for us to slip into a short break. We'll get you more COVID news on the other side. Stay with us. COVID numbers, and India today reported 40,715 new cases of coronavirus. That has come down over the last 2 days. However, it's still significantly high. So let's take a look at the states that are, the big worry as far as the numbers go. And 199 deaths have also taken place during this period. So let's just bring up the top 5 states. And there you can see Maharashtra remains the big worry. Maharashtra reporting 24,645. But this is lower, and that is why the number has come down today. It's lower than what we were seeing in the last 2 days. Punjab, a big worry with 2,299, and now the report has come that many of the positive cases have been found to be of the UK variant, and remember that's a more infectious variant. Gujarat, Chhattisgarh, Karnataka also a big worry there. And if we take a look at the deaths, and this was something that was quite worrying. If you take a look here, you can see Punjab and Maharashtra both reporting 58 deaths in the last 24 hours. So even though Maharashtra has such a high number of cases, Punjab and Maharashtra both reporting the same number of deaths, followed by Chhattisgarh, Kerala, same number at 12. And then Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Delhi now coming into the picture as well. Delhi is seeing an increase in the number of cases. Now, if we talk about coronavirus, one is, of course, the period when you're infected with the virus, and there you have various symptoms. You could lose your sense of smell, you could have high fever, and it's been found to be a broad spectrum. It's found that coronavirus affects various organs. It's not just the lungs that get affected. So take a look at this study that has found after you've tested negative for COVID, you still continue to have a number of symptoms there. You have fatigue. This is something that has been reported again and again. Fatigue. Many people have a persistent cough as well. Many people having sleep disturbances, depression, anxiety, of course, because we're in a pandemic. If you have COVID, you generally do get extremely anxious, and that is something that a lot of people have been talking about. Headaches continuing, palpitations, chest pain, and also hair loss. This is something that many people have been talking about post-COVID. So as you can see, the symptoms carry on even after the COVID is negative. Even after you've tested negative for COVID, after going through the infection, there are a number of symptoms that continue, and this is called long COVID. The only way to combat this is, of course, the vaccine, and just not get COVID in the first place and have a vaccine that protects you. But vaccine hesitancy remains a big, big worry. In fact, India is much better. If I can just take you through this. So this study shows 64% of people are willing to take vaccines. So that's the only amount of people who are willing to take the vaccines in the entire population. According to the study, 64%. 6 months to 1 year is what 31% of the people are willing to wait, and only 33% are willing to get it as soon as possible. And if I can just show you, India is doing the best here, in which you have 51% who are willing to get the vaccine as soon as possible, and the remaining amount want to wait for 6 months to a year. And you can just take a look at the other countries: Russia, South Africa, Kenya, and the UAE, China as well. 45% are willing to get the vaccine immediately, while the others want to wait. So vaccine hesitancy remains a big, big issue that needs to be countered if we're to get ahead of this pandemic. Well, that's all the time we have today on the show. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.